I want to welcome everyone. If you're just logging on for today's program, we will just take a minute and make sure everyone has a chance to log on. We're always interested if you want to put in the chat where you're zooming in from. If you know Gabrielle, you want to give her a message, please go ahead. You just want to make sure if you want everyone to see what you're chatting, change your setting to all panelists and all attendees, unless you want to send a private message. So welcome, we'll start the program shortly. Welcome. If you're just logging on today, I want to welcome everyone to our afternoon program. We'll wait just one more minute, make sure everyone has a chance to log on. You're welcome to put a message in the chat if you would like, and we'll keep the Q&A for your questions. Thank you. We'll start very shortly. Wonderful. I think we will get started. Good day. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Judy Margles. I am the director at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. Please, a really warm welcome to everyone for joining us for today's discussion with author Gabrielle Glaser and her new book, American Baby. I also want to thank the Middleman Jewish Community Center, a partner for today's program. The museum's mission is to explore the legacy of the Jewish experience in Oregon, teach the universal lessons of the Holocaust, and provide opportunities for intercultural conversation. We challenge our visitors to resist indifference and discrimination and to envision a just and inclusive world. All of our virtual programming, including today's event and recordings of past events, are offered free of charge. We would be grateful for any donation that you might be able to make to support the museum or the MJCC, or join as a member if you have not already done so. We offer a range of programs. We have a really packed schedule for March and April. All our events can be found on our website. Today's program focuses on post-war adoption, a subject that a Jewish museum and Holocaust center might not normally take on. But the book, American Baby, has a poignant Portland connection. Its center is the story of David Rosenberg, who had been the cantor at Sherry Torah Synagogue before his untimely death in 2014. David Rosenberg was put up for adoption by his teenage parents, his teenage mother, unwillingly, I might add. This was the tail end of 1961, well before birth control became ubiquitous in the United States, a time when the idea of an unwed teen becoming pregnant was thought to be so scandalous that the pregnant young women were often sent away to have their babies. In this case, the scandal that Gabrielle relates is not about unwed teens, but about the scandalous adoption industry. I'm delighted to welcome Gabrielle Glaser back to Portland, her hometown, where she was once a features writer for the Oregonian and also wrote for the Jewish Review. Today, she is a New York Times bestselling author and journalist whose work on mental health, medicine, and culture has appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. She's also appeared on many national radio and television programs, including National Public Radio's Fresh Air, All Things Considered, WNYC's On the Media, NBC's Nightly News, and ABC's World News Tonight. If you haven't yet had a chance to read the book, American Baby, our museum shop is going to be open next week, Tuesday through Friday, in advance of Passover. We have copies of the book available. So you can come in, do your Passover shopping, and get a copy of the book. For today, I'm going to engage in a discussion with Gabrielle for the first part of the program, then open it up for your questions, which I do ask you to put in the question and answer tab, the Q&A tab. Welcome, Gabrielle, and congratulations on the publication of your book. So thank you so much for being here. And you're zooming in from New York, right?
Not to brag, New Jersey.
Oh, New Jersey. So I think I'll just ask you you a question that kind of gives you an opportunity to really talk about why you decided to write this book. I know that you first met David Rosenberg in 2007. You wrote about him in 2007. You wrote about him after his death in 2015. So talk a little bit about how this story sort of fell into place. How did you first meet David? Why did you decide to move forward with writing the book?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. I'll answer that in a second. I just blurted out that I was in New Jersey before anything else. So thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody in Portland, in Oregon. It's nice to at least have a virtual connection to my home. And sorry, it's like a super sunny day here for the first time in ages. So I'm going to try to make sure I'm out of the glare. I was as a writer at the Oregonian, I covered adoption and how Oregonians in particular make their families. I covered reproductive technology. And when David, as you said, who was a very well-known and beloved figure in Portland, when he was receiving a kidney, he was an adopted man, and he was receiving a kidney from his friend Marshall Spector, a fellow congregant at Sherry Torah. The story first, I think, was pitched to someone on the business desk, and because I had covered adoption, that reporter, Jonathan Brinkman, forwarded the story idea to me. And I thought, wow, this is really a great story. These two guys who were from back east, as we say. Marshall's from the Washington area, and he met David as a congregant. And they determined that Marshall, when David needed a kidney, it was determined that Marshall was the best match. Many people from David's community stepped forward to see if they were appropriate matches. And it turned out that these two men who were from big city, back east, back east big cities, actually had this connection from the old country as well. David's adoptive father had been there was a rabbinical cantorial connection. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was sort of a beautiful narrative. These two men who were on the frontier had this deep connection to the old world. And when I called David and also in addition to that, it's important to note for Oregonians that at the time, Oregon, it probably still is the case, Oregon was a national leader in living kidney donors. So it was a story that was really ostensibly to highlight Oregon's generosity as a leader in organ donations, living donations. And also, David wanted to publicize the fact that this is a long wind up, but it's an Oregon audience. David wanted to publicize the fact that the Orthodox rabbinate had recently, I don't want to get this wrong, but anyway, it was sudden. There was a new a lifting on a ban of donating living tissue. And he wanted to get into that. I'm not sure we actually did get into that in the piece for the Oregonian. Maybe we did, but
just read it.
I met David for the first time at a dialysis center on Sunset Boulevard. He invited me to meet him there, which was an incredibly intimate place for a first-time meeting. And David was a larger than life guy. He was outsized and, he had such an outsized personality. He was so gregarious and just such an incredibly friendly guy, extrovert to the extreme, and said, come meet me there. And I said, are you sure? And he said, no, yeah, come. And in that first meeting, we talked about how he had been adopted and how his mother, he said, really just flat out in our first, during this first interview, that his mother had been a girl in trouble in New York City, and that he had been surrendered to the, as he put it, given up. and adopted through the Louise Wise Agency in Manhattan, and that he hoped somehow that the story might go viral, that she would see it, and that he would be able to learn more medical information for his three kids, Sam, Noah, and Esty. And of course, his wife, Kim, Danish Rosenberg, was also very much a part of the story. I got to know the entire mishpucha. I got to know Marshall, and it was a pretty standard feature story that ran in 2007. I want to say just before Yom Kippur.
Mm-hmm.
And it was impossible. It is impossible to get to know the Rosenbergs and not to become their friends. They're just the most generous, extraordinary family. I got to know Carol and Cy as well, and Kim's siblings. And over the years, my husband and I, who you know, Steve Engelberg, and I and our three daughters left Portland. We moved to New Jersey in 2008. But over the years, I kept coming home to see my family in Portland. And I would, a couple times, I think I had lunch with Kim. Once I met David for coffee. And the story sort of hovered. David's health was not doing well. And at one point, I met David at the Lovejoy Cafe, and he mentioned again that, you know, he didn't think he was ever going to meet his birth family, and to be able to find, he was very careful. He wanted to put it in the context of finding more medical information for his kids.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2014, fast forward, in 2014, David had discovered through a DNA test that Kim had given him for his birthday a distant cousin who was able to match David to his birth mother, Margaret Katz. And it turned out that even though she had been a teenage girl, as he put it, again, in trouble, she had married his birth father. She had done everything she could to try to get, retain custody of her infant son. And also, he had three full siblings that he was really excited about, including one who was an opera singer. His baby sister was an opera singer. And he called to tell me that, he'd made this amazing connection, that he'd located his birth mother and his whole birth family. It was late May of 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And he called and said, I saw his name on my caller ID. He said, "Hey, it's David Rosenberg. Are you sitting down?" And I said, "Well, now I am." What is the answer when someone asks you, "Are you sitting down?" Well, you better if you're not already. So now I am. And he said, "I found my birth mother, and she lives 45 minutes from you." He had mapped it out on Google Maps.
Crazy. Amazing story. Just amazing. Well, I'm trying to think of the direction to go now. Let's move a little bit into, before we come back to David's story, which I think our audiences are going to be interested in hearing more about. But let's just talk a little bit about sort of the nucleus of your book, which is about American adoption in the 50s and the 60s, right? And there was this real upsurge of national activist movements of mothers and adoptees seeking information in recent years, right? We've seen this in recent years, that there's not that taboo anymore. And that, of course, has helped to open archives in various states, right? So now you are, the access to information is not what it was for when Margaret had her baby. But talk a little bit about the progress that we are seeing, the challenges, and if you know specifically about Oregon law, love to hear it.
I do. So one of the things that propelled me to want to write this book was that the story of the forces that had separated Margaret and David for 52 years were social and political and legal and religious and societal.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just a story of one mother and her son who had been separated by this adoption industry, which was extremely lucrative. It was a vast nationwide system. And you mentioned in the introduction that birth control was difficult to obtain even for some married couples. Abortion was, of course, illegal. Sex education was unheard of. And the sexual revolution was simmering at that
Right.
in the post-war years. And we think of, oh, it's, all happening in the summer of love, but in fact, there was a slow simmer all the way up to that. And about 3.5 young women who were not married got pregnant and got forced into this secretive system of which Margaret was a part.
Hmm.
And what happened, and the reason that some of that this secrecy, that this separation of David and Margaret for more than a half century, was that in all but two states, Alaska and Kansas, there was a dual system of birth certificates, so that if a child who was born, if a child who was a child who was adopted had been born out of wedlock, the child was issued an original birth certificate that was then sealed under state file and accessible only to some judges and adoption officials. And it really put a thick line between all people who'd been surrendered for adoption and their birth families. And what happened in its stead was when a child was adopted, they were issued an amended birth certificate that listed the new adoptive name and the parents who were the adoptive parents as the original mother and father. And there was really no hope of ever reuniting of people who, adult adoptees ever finding their birth kin until first Oregon was the third state in the nation after Alaska and Kansas to open birth certificates for adoptees. There was, I believe it was Prop 58, and I know it was in the late 1990s. I think 1998 it was finally adopted in the year 2000, and it issued free and open access to all people adopted in the state of Oregon to their original identities. And the fight for that, and the reason that I wanted to pursue this story, is because it is an issue of social justice.
Yeah.
I believe that it is a civil and human right for every single person to be able to access their original identities. And that progress has been extremely slow and arduous and difficult. And only 9 states, Oregon, Alaska, Kansas, now New York, Maine, Colorado, New Hampshire, I'm blanking on the two other ones, are the only states in the country that allow grown men and women to obtain their original identities. To me, that is patently, it's a ludicrous anachronism. The theory was at the time it's going to protect the child from the taint of illegitimacy. It is going to shield the woman from the stigma of having given a child, of having had having gotten pregnant out of wedlock. And it was also reassuring to adopted parents who were desperately trying to join the baby boom, understandably, in those years after the war. If you couldn't conceive a child, adoption was the only way that you could create your family. And this dual system of these two birth certificates reassured adopted parents that no birth relatives would come to interfere with their newly created family.
Hmm.
So Texas, California, Florida, Minnesota, Virginia, Georgia, you name it, those states still adamantly refuse to allow. I mean, it's to me, it is an astonishing anachronism.
And I really appreciate it because certainly it wasn't something, the words civil rights and adoption rights aren't something that I had ever equated before you made it so clear in the book how the civil rights of Margaret were completely denied, how institutions failed her in her quest. You want to dig a little deeper into that, perhaps, if you want to talk about some of the things Margaret had to endure? And then perhaps if you want to read, we talked about this beautiful passage where she does see Stephen. If you want to read that as well right now, that would be awesome. But maybe this, talk a little bit more about this, how you see it as a civil rights issue.
So Margaret was the child of two refugees from Nazi Europe. She grew up in Upper Manhattan, and her boyfriend, later husband, George Katz, David's birth father, was the son of two Holocaust survivors. And as soon as Margaret was discovered to be pregnant, she was sent away to a maternity home on the most remote borough of New York City, which is Staten Island.
Mhm.
And she was denied any information about the finality of adoption. She didn't ever have an attorney present. This was a huge event in the life of a young girl. And her mother was the one signing her into, her mother, who was horrified at the pregnancy of her teenage daughter, was incredibly punitive, signed her into this maternity home owned by the Louise Weiss Services, which is the
Mhm.
Jewish adoption agency in New York City. Um, and it was once she was into the system, which was, as I mentioned, extremely lucrative. Louise Wise's coffers grew by 600% between 1950 and 1966. Um, Once she was into the system, she really had no way out whatsoever. And the final straw, she and George had plans to elope. He was a pitcher. He was an extraordinary baseball player who'd won a scholarship to Ohio State, and which he relinquished in order to try to marry Margaret quickly and make sure that they could really convince Louise Wise officials, New York City officials, that they were fit parents and they could have custody of their baby. He would go to arcades and use his pitcher's arm to win blenders and toasters and cutlery, and they would take Polaroid pictures and show the social workers, look, we're serious, we've got kitchen stuff. And they were teenagers, but they still had this idea and this dream that they could keep their child. And Margaret was continually badgered. She was continually lied to. She was told that that a diplomat was going to adopt David. Ultimately, he was adopted by this extraordinary couple from Romania, two Holocaust survivors who loved him very much, and he them. But Cantor Ephraim Rosenberg was a cantor. He wasn't a diplomat. And they used lots of carrots for these young women throughout the country. So, so I'll read you, as we discussed, I'll read you a little part from the book where Margaret had refused to sign the surrender papers. They really believed that they could string this along even after David's birth. David was named Stephen, as you said. And she and George are going to visit him at a social services office in downtown New York City. It would have been March of 1962, so almost 60 years ago this month. In March, an unsuspecting Margaret and George were granted permission to see Stephen for a brief meeting. They were giddy with excitement, thinking it was a step in the direction of custody, and they each arranged for the afternoon off. Margaret wrapped the green sweater and hat set she had secretly knit for Stephen at Lakeview, that was the maternity home, and put them in a bag with a rattle and some small toys they'd picked out for him at a baby store. George brought along his Polaroid. It was a chilly day, and Margaret, who had shed almost all of her pregnancy weight, carefully dressed in a pleated wool skirt, a sweater set, and her heavy winter coat. George wore a suit, a freshly ironed white shirt, and a tie. The young couple surmised that Stephen was being evaluated, but they were sure they were too. George had the pictures taken of all the home goods that he'd won that were hiding under his bed at home. They had enough to stock nearly an entire kitchen. George and Margaret wanted to appear as respectable couple, the sort of young people to whom a baby could be entrusted. They held hands on the subway downtown, but stopped touching each other the minute they entered the imposing gray city building. A secretary ushered them into a cold room with nothing but chairs and a table. Finally, they heard a baby's cry and the click of heels coming down the corridor. Margaret and George leapt to their feet. A social worker came through the door, holding an infant carrier in the crook of her arm. A fussy 3-month Stephen sat inside. Margaret rushed to her baby with outstretched arms, not caring who was watching. She unbuckled her son from his plastic chair and held him in her arms for the first time. She kissed his cheeks a dozen times before handing him to George, who had never held a baby. Am I doing this right? He asked as he balanced Stephen's head in his elbow.
Thank you. First time I read that, I was choking up. I feel sort of similar right now. I mean, it's, and then if I remember, you go on there, just she notices that Stephen had been circumcised, and she was very pleased about that, right? That they had given him a bris. So you've mentioned Louise Weiss Services, and some of us, I'm familiar with that name only because of the callous way that they split up twins and triplets. I can't remember now the name of the film that came out about the triplets that.
Yes, there was a film called Three Identical Strangers. There was
That's
also
it.
a
That's
book. There was also a book of that by two twins who had been identical twins who had been separated, Paula Bernstein and Elise Shine, called Identical Strangers. So
I mean, these are coercive, they're predatory. I mean, the practices at Louise Weiss Services and others, I think you have a couple of other anecdotes. Tell us a little bit more about these practices and how did, from our vantage point, of course, how did they ever get away with them?
well, it was a completely sorry about the sun. It was a completely unregulated industry. And they really had the notion, and I found this in the documents, that they were playing God. And what struck me the most about Louise Wise Services was that they had a number of practices. Maybe we'll have time to get to that. But Louise Wise Services was founded, by the way, by the wife of Rabbi Stephen Wise, shortly after their stay in Portland, where they had been at Beth Israel. I'm sure you know. And originally, the idea for the Louise Wise Agency, which was called the Free Synagogue Adoption Committee initially, was to place Jewish orphans who had been orphaned by um, parents who've been made sick in the garment industry primarily, um, placing young immigrant children in Jewish homes and giving them a quote unquote better life. But after the war, because of a huge rise in unwed pregnancy, the rise of unwed pregnancy, I think I forgot to mention this, tripled between 1946 and 1966. And prior to the war, if you had gotten pregnant before getting married, you would have been forced into a shotgun wedding. But suddenly there was a new middle class to aspire to. And parents did not want their children, their teenage children, to have to forego the possibility of going to college, of anything that might stand in the way of a beautiful new middle class life that was finally um, going to be accessible for working class Jews as well. And the Louise Wise Agency really understood that, and I hate to say it, but understood it as a business model
Mm.
as well. Jews were also, everybody wanted to have a child during the baby boom. All right. That was a woman's role. A woman, as Betty Friedan wrote, the only way for a woman to get fulfillment was to have a child. She said that, yeah, obviously wink, wink, but that, that was the impetus for women in the years after the war. And above all, that was the impetus for Jewish women and Jewish families who were, after all, creating life in the shadow of the Holocaust. And that to me was a veil sort of hanging over the entire enterprise of Louise Wise itself. Nobody talked about it. Nobody was talking about the Holocaust in the years immediately following the Shoah. But I believe it was an ongoing, not even subconscious drive to provide Jewish families with what they said in meeting notes, in Louise Wise meeting notes, with premium babies. Premium babies deserve to go to premium babies should go to premium families. And there was even documentation of calling the babies blue ribbon babies. So that was that the more I discovered, the more I looked into this agency and its archives that are at Columbia University Medical Center, the more I realized, wow, this was happening in plain sight. But with no oversight.
So I really, sometimes when I was reading the book, I literally had to put it down. I was just so infuriated. I mean, there was so much of that book that you just like jaws clenched and my head spinning. The way Margaret was treated and these overall issues that you raised between with adoption in the 1950s and the 1960s. So could you talk a little bit about your writing process and how you kept your own emotions in check?
Oh, that's a good question. I didn't always keep my emotions in check. I think there were periods, and I look back at it now. The book was supposed to come out last June, and I sort of put it away for several months. I was writing
Mhm.
about COVID, and I wasn't really thinking about it. And then it's hard to read your own work, especially when you read it and read it and read it and reread it and reread it and reread it. And so I listened to some of it, and I realized in listening to the audio version of it, wow, I was really angry when I was writing that chapter,
Mm.
or that was really devastating. That was wrenching. I'll get to something in a minute, but it was also difficult to deal with Margaret's memories. Margaret, as David rightly pointed out, lives 45 minutes from me, and I would go visit her, and we would go out for lunch, and I would come back. I would turn onto the turnpike, the New Jersey Turnpike, get on my exit, merge on, and sometimes I would cry
Mm.
for probably a good, I don't know, however long. Not, I mean, it was like I sobbed all the way home, but the her courage and her resilience and and everything she tried to do, she really literally tried to talk back to City Hall. And ultimately, she was completely forced into signing the papers because um, under New York state law until 1971, it was actually a crime to have premarital sex. And she was a month shy of her 18th birthday. And really, as we said, fully intending to try to keep custody of her son, to get married and start their lives early as a family of three. New York City officials really had her over a barrel and said, if you don't sign these papers right now, we will send you to juvie. And that for her was the last straw. And that happened nationwide. That happened to young women who were minors nationwide. Not only did they have to endure the shame of their pregnancies and the stigma, the secrecy of an actual human being, keeping a human being a secret, they were threatened with jail time. Jail time.
Mm.
So that a lot of that made me angry, and the absolute how all of this landed on the shoulders of young women, and with almost no repercussions for young men. Of course, they too suffered, but not in the ways that young women did. So it was a combination of Well, I'll put it this way. I started out writing with sadness and curiosity,
Mhm.
and I knew the numbers. I saw on Facebook that there were millions of women that this had happened to. There were two other books. A woman had done an incredible oral history of young women to whom this happened, called The Girls Who Went Away. There was another book called Wake Up Little Susie by a social historian named Ricky Solinger. So I relied on those for the framework. But the story itself, the story of David and Margaret, really was a way to tell the larger piece. And yeah, I was angry and sad.
Yeah.
I started it. Oh, but I was going to say I started it with curiosity and sadness, and I ended it with a call to action. We can change these laws in other states. It's up to it's up to legislators to do that. It's up to people to understand that this is a human and civil right that we can address.
And we know the only way that David ultimately made a connection with his birth mother was through, you mentioned that he had been given 23andMe, right? The DNA testing as a birthday gift or as a gift. And um, I don't know whether this is even a valid question, but without that, could you have imagined, did David think there might have been, or did the family think there might have ever been another way to connect? And given um, how widespread DNA has really given people access to their birth parents, and it really does raise these complex ideas about the identity of families. So how is this all changing with DNA studies?
It's a really good question. And many adoptees turn to the large companies, 23andMe, Ancestry. I think there's another one called Family Tree DNA. Typically, if they're really hoping to link with relatives, especially in closed states, they take all three of them and they hope to match with a half sibling or a distant cousin who may be able to then, in David's case, David linked with a distant cousin, a third or fourth cousin, who happened to have been, she's in Georgia. Her name is Sandy Baumwald.
Hmm.
Also, only she's a child of two Holocaust survivors herself. And she is in Athens, Georgia. She's an attorney. She has excellent genealogical skills. She is very devoted to family history, and she was able to locate Margaret for David in a span of 3 weeks. But it was a series of small miracles and clues that had been left for on David's non-identifying information at the adoption agency. And she had to go through, but it's really complicated, but she had to go through all these hoops. This is before New York State had opened up the laws. That happened in 2020. So Sandy was doing the search in 2014.
Hmm.
And it has helped immensely for so many adoptees, but it is also so dependent on the fact that they have a Sandy Baumwald.
Right.
If you are an adoptee, that you it depends on, well, who do you match with? Do you match with a third cousin, or do you match with a half sister? It depends entirely on whether or not someone else in your family had the idea to send off a vial of saliva to big tech. Not everybody wants to do that.
Right. Right. And there's actually, I think I'll just ask a question from the chat because I think it follows up to what we're talking about now. And what about, um, what do you say about birth mothers who don't necessarily want to be found, right? Um, the question is, what to say, what are your feelings about women who don't want to be found, women whose lives would be upended after their carefully guarded secret comes out because the child they had relinquished for adoption, all of a sudden comes into contact. So,
I would say I absolutely believe in an adoptee's right to understand his or her origin story. And
mhm,
even if the birth mother chooses to retain that secret and maintain that secret, it is the right of every human being to understand where he or she came from. So I don't agree that birth mothers should, certainly they're allowed to do, their they have free agency to be able to say, I don't want contact with you, no one else knows about you. Of course, that's wrenching, and I hear from people who to whom this happens, well, every day now. But actually, I don't. That's not true. I hear about it occasionally.
Mhm.
I hear reunion stories every day, but I don't hear about. I mean, it's seldom, and I will tell you the numbers do not bear it out. In the states in which there are some states that have partially opened records, in New Jersey is one of them. It voted to open original birth certificates to adoptees in 2014, but it gave a 2.5 year window to birth mothers to redact their names. And in New Jersey and in other states that have allowed this, 0.05% of women choose to do this. So, number one, most birth mothers truly want to be found.
Mhm.
Number two, as I said, I absolutely believe it is an adult adoptee's right to be able to learn where they come from. And I see a question. Um, yeah, I just saw that, Kathy. It's very rare that birth mothers don't want to be found. It's exceedingly rare. Rare. Carol Newman asked a question. I know a little bit about the origins of the Oregon law, and there's a um, there was I hope I have this right, but it's my understanding that adoptee rights activists looked at Oregon, and because of the referendum, the possibility of changing laws through referendum in Oregon, they were very careful about where they wanted to which state they wanted to choose first. And Oregon, because of its pioneer aspect in so many civil rights and so many progressive politics, they chose. It's my understanding, Carol, having spoken to some of the original folks who were involved in this, that Oregon was a great place to start. And they thought that once it happened in Oregon, it would really change elsewhere in the country. The next state they adoptee rights activists tackled was Alabama, because someone had left $100,000 grant to try to change the law there, and it went to Alabama next. But Oregon was because of the referendum system. That's why they chose Oregon. But as Carol pointed out, it did take some time. There was pushback in the legislature, and well, what about birth mothers? What about birth mother privacy? And that's something else that's a fallacy that I want to address. There is a theory that birth mothers were promised lifelong confidentiality, but in a series of really long legal analyses, there's a professor in Baltimore named Elizabeth Samuelson. She has studied this issue nationwide. She has copies of surrender papers from Hawaii to Vermont, from Florida to Washington State. And it is impossible from a legal perspective to promise someone confidentiality in perpetuity. So that's a fallacy. They may have been reassured verbally that you can keep this secret, but legally it was impossible to ever promise anybody that.
So are all adoption laws that we know at state laws? Are there federal laws as well? Or
There are no federal laws. It is a state to state. It's a state. It's a state's rights law.
is
States' rights.
there a movement um, to make it law in any states that adoptees have the right to find their birth parents? And the
Yes,
birth
it
parents do not have the right to say, I do not want to be found?
It's ongoing in some of the bigger states. There's a bill in Texas. There's a move afoot in California. There's a bill in Minnesota. There's a bill in Maryland. There's a bill in Connecticut right now.
Mm-hmm.
And there is the hope that this is getting some nationwide steam at this moment of national reckoning, where we look at our history of systemic racism, at our history of of oppression in all ways, and some people are finally coming around to the idea that, oh, yeah, you're right, this is wrong, this is wrong.
Gabrielle, just because a couple of people have just asked, do you want to just take a moment, if you will, and just describe for us David, as you did so eloquently in the book, David's meeting of Margaret for the first time? I think
Margaret and her daughter, David's sister, Sherry Rose Katz, who was an opera singer in Berlin, came from New Jersey to meet David for the first time. He was not well. This would have been in July of 2014. And Margaret was exceedingly nervous. She got off the plane in Portland, never having, I don't think she'd been to the West Coast. Kim was there to pick up her husband's birth mother and husband's birth sister at the airport. And they drove to the Rosenberg house at that time was in Southwest. And I'm pointing southwest in New Jersey, which is sort of funny. And Margaret got out of the car to see her and saw her son for the first time and embraced him. And the Rosenbergs were unbelievably generous to David's newfound family. The boys vacated their rooms. I believe it was Noah who vacated. Noah vacated his bedroom for Sherry, and Margaret slept in a room. I think it was the family art room, and they hosted them for 3 weeks, which had to have been really, really emotional time for everybody. Here is a blind date with the mother you've never met and the sister you've never met, and with a husband and father who is in decline. At that point, David had been diagnosed with thyroid cancer. And I think the way everybody handled it was with exceeding grace, which is how anybody who knows the Rosenbergs knows that that's how they operate. But I do know that David and Margaret would go to lunch. I think they went to veterinary appointments with his little dog Gordy, and they would go to lunch, and David would identify, he would introduce to the waiters Margaret as his birth mother. And I know there was a big gathering at the house. I think they ordered from Katz's Deli in New York. And it was, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall, but I just have to hand it to everybody involved what that must have been like, what those 3 weeks must have been like for the kids, for Kim, for Margaret, for Sherry, for David. What was it like for David to have understood that he hadn't been given up, to have reversed that narrative of what it was like to have been wanted and cherished in absentia?
Mhm.
What was that like? What was that like to integrate the love of two different families of the Rosenbergs who cherished him and gave him every opportunity and really cherished him? I can't emphasize enough how much every single person I talked to, whether it was in Israel or Toronto, where David also grew up, said these people were absolutely in love with their son and he with them. So what was that like to have two parents, two different sets of parents at the end of one's life?
And of course, this utterly mesmerizing fact about David, that he has a birth sister, if that's the right phrase, who's an opera singer, and his his father was a cantor, and of course he had, we who knew him in Portland were very much aware of this utterly gorgeous voice he had. So there's this idea that he was, the family um, he grew up in was exactly the right family for someone with his talent. Rather an extraordinary thinking. Someone just wanted you to react to a scenario of a teenager who might have had a pregnancy, married, kept it secret, and then was unable to have babies after that and didn't want to reveal that pregnancy. Is that a scenario you came across in your research from someone who confided that the only baby that they were able to deliver was one they had to give up?
That was a fairly common scenario, and it is fairly well studied among birth mothers from that period, which is called the baby scoop era, by the way. Um, the secondary infertility that was um, that existed among birth mothers was something that was it was not at all uncommon. I don't have the statistics on the top of my head, or even if they are even available, because so many women at this time did keep that a secret. Um,
Mm.
what were the reasons for that? Who knows? I know also that there were some rumors that some women, because in that period, it's also, and this has never been proven, but I have spoken to a couple of obstetricians from that era, and because women were knocked out during that during labor and delivery during that period, it's really difficult to know what actually happened to them. And there is evidence that there were some sterilizations that occurred without the woman's consent. And the theory was that these women are not fit to become mothers in the first place, and we're just gonna fix this societal problem right here, right now, with me as the doctor deciding. So I don't know about the statistics for that. I certainly have heard of that, and it would be difficult to, to give numbers for the secondary infertility, but I sure know that it occurred.
And Margaret did not tell her children that she had had a baby previous to the other three. She
No,
kept that
yeah,
secret.
she kept that a secret.
Did
Yeah.
she talk about that? Is she still alive? I
Yeah,
realize. Oh, oh,
she is very much still alive, and is really sort of galvanized by the adoptee rights movement, and she's speaking at occasional events, and she's become, I heard somebody call her the New York New York Philomena. So
that's great. That's great. Someone's asking about a book. I'm not familiar with the book by Danny Shapiro called Inheritance. Is that a book you know? Do you know that
yes,
book? Uh,
yes, Amy Shapiro is a memoirist and an essayist who grew up in an Orthodox community in New Jersey, but her father had been unable to father a child or a second child, and her mother received a sperm donation that she kept as a secret all of Danny's life. And
mm,
Danny discovered that she took a DNA test and discovered not only did she not match at all with the half sister she believed had been her half sister, her birth father, her biological father, was a physician in Portland, of all places. So, yeah, this issue of secrecy is something that is really, this is one version. This is the point of, this is kind of 1.0, secrecy 1.0 of original identities, but this is an issue that is definitely going to be part of the conversation for a very long time with sperm and egg donation for sure.
Well, I grew up knowing I had cousins in New York City who were adopted, and everybody knew that they were adopted except the children. And we were under as children. They would come visit. We lived outside of Toronto, and they would come visit, and we were under strict orders as children to keep this a secret. And it was so mystifying for us to really understand how to parse it. They now know. They were told, but they were told as adults in their 30s.
Mm.
So very, very strange. Someone mentioned, and I'm not quite sure. So I'll just read the question because I didn't quite grasp this from reading the book. Gabrielle, I believe you mentioned that the reunion fell off for a while. Betty Jane Lifton talks about the stages of reunion, and that's common for that to happen after the honeymoon. But there wasn't really a falling off, was there, after they met? No.
No, I just would say that that's really common in, David died and Margaret and Sherry and the Rosenbergs had their, I don't want to speak for them, I'm not terribly comfortable talking about this, but I will say that it is very common as Kathy points out. And I would just say that it's like there's a reunion and it's sort of like a marriage, there's a wedding, and what happens after the wedding is what happens after the wedding is extremely complicated and involves so many different people and so many different feelings and so many different ways that it can turn out. Just when you get married, everybody has a wedding, but not every marriage is the same. And adoption, here's what I will say: adoption is not finite. And we used to think that, oh, okay, this person was adopted, that's it. No more needs to be said. And that's really not true. It's multi-generational. It affects the birth parents, the birth siblings, it affects the adoptee, it affects the adoptee's spouse, it affects the adoptee's children, and it's ongoing. Just the other day, I got, almost every day now, I get emails from people who had an adopted parent or an adopted grandparent, and they need help in searching. And in states where the records are fully closed and you need a death certificate to be able to try to petition a judge for what the original name was. And it's if you can just picture it, as Jews, we have this whole notion of cherishing our where we come from and of continuation. But if you're adopted, your family tree is a mystery. Your roots are obscured.
Yeah. Thank you. We're running up to the clock. I think we're going to keep talking just a few more minutes, if that's okay with you, Gabrielle. So if you have a question, now is the time to ask it. There have been a few questions about your research. I am one of these people who read the notes and the all the research. So it was voluminous, your notes and all your research. But in addition to the interviews, you interviewed numerous people extensively. Talk a little bit about other areas of research that you went into to get the book together.
One thing that I discovered, and I didn't know we're coming up, one thing I discovered was something called practice homes that occurred in universities, land grant universities from Cornell all the way to Oregon State. 50 universities developed a program where they would take babies who had been surrendered from adoption agencies and use them in home ec departments in what they called practice homes, literally and figuratively. The girls, the college students, were learning how to keep house properly, how to iron properly, how to keep finances, how to clean windows properly. And someone came up with the idea at Cornell, as I said, in 1919, to use babies to practice on. And Oregon State University for decades had this practice, a practice home where 1,500 home ec students had among them 50 babies who they passed around and learned how to diaper, learned how to feed, learned how to put down for a nap. And there was voluminous information about how much creamed spinach or strained pears a baby would have, how much formula they drank, but absolutely no regard whatsoever for the emotional impact, lifelong emotional impact of being passed around literally like a baby football, sometimes hour to hour, sometimes week to week. Sometimes you would be assigned a baby, the third week of April, 1949. And then the next week you would have another baby. So that was really shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing. Thank you so much. What a wonderful program. You'll see in the chat, you're getting amazing accolades for your book and this presentation. We cannot thank you enough. I'm going to put my best Rachel Maddow voice on. The book is called American Baby. It's just a beautiful read. As I said, alternatively, you're going to be crying and laughing and infuriated and really happy in places too. I think the emotional range that you put forth in this book is really extraordinary, and I commend you for that. We have copies of the book. Lots of independent bookstores in Portland have copies of the book, and we have copies which will be available next week. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to everyone for coming, and I hope we'll see you in Portland sometime.
I hope so. I hope to come be out later this spring. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate all your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to them. You can definitely reach me on Twitter at Gabrielle Glaser, or you can reach me through my website, gabrielleglaser.com. Please feel free to send any questions you want. And what a pleasure to have been out with all of you. Sorry for the glare. I should have moved my computer.
You're beaming. We love it. Thank you, everyone. We'll say goodbye and look forward to seeing you at another program. Gabrielle, thank you so much. It was beautiful. Wonderful. Bye.
Bye.